Okay, let's talk about assessments. A lot of this presentation is actually going to be going back to what we had just discussed about objectives because objectives and assessment really cannot be separated. So, one major purpose of assessment is that it helps you measure whether or not your students have met the objectives of the lesson. That's really what you should be thinking about as you're crafting both your objectives and your assessments because the whole measurable element of your objectives should come through the assessments that you plan. So, by collecting diverse forms of data from informal, formative, and summative assessments, you'll be better informed with regard to student progress and whether or not your pedagogical approach is working, or if you need to make a shift or even reteach a concept. And so, really, the purpose of an assessment is twofold. Are students learning? Yes or no? And if not, is there some sort of shift that needs to happen in your teaching for the next lesson? So there are two main types of assessments we will talk about in this section. One is formative and the other one is summative. Formative and summative assessments are interconnected, so you cannot separate them. They are, one plays on the other, essentially. So you should use a summative assessment as sort of a target at the end of a unit, and a formative assessment should be used as quick data points to help a teacher understand whether or not students are making necessary progress towards that summative assessment, that target. Most formative assessment is informal with interactive and timely feedback and response. It helps inform a teacher on what needs to be practiced, retaught, or how logically to proceed with the next lesson. Summative assessments are typically more formal and come at the end of a unit to measure student learning over an extended period of time. So formative is going to be those short, quick, daily check-ins that you're going to use for assessments that help you understand whether students are on track for their summative assessment that you've already planned. Formative assessments, you can view those as assessments for learning, so taken at varying intervals throughout a unit in order to provide opportunities for feedback that will help improve the quality of student learning. So examples of formative assessments could be things like quizzes, homework assignments, journals, projects, and other performance tasks. So just those daily, quick assessments that might come in the form of the end of a lesson or sometimes in the middle of a lesson. And that's different from an assessment, a summative assessment, because that's an assessment of learning. And so if you think about the difference in assessment for learning, your formative assessments should be talking about it provides you with an opportunity to provide students with feedback so that they can learn and develop the skills they'll need for their assessment of learning. That's the big thing that you'll measure at the end. Generally taken by students at the end of a unit or semester to demonstrate the sum of what they have learned. So it's the big picture. It's the overall thing that you want them to know. Many teachers understand these to be more traditional, and so typically you're going to see teachers talk about their summative assessments as maybe like an essay or even multiple choice test that covers all of the big ideas that you've looked at over an entire unit or even over an entire course. That's why your standardized tests at the end of the year might be considered a summative assessment. So other examples, I would say they do not have to be traditional. So some other examples are written products. Perhaps it's a narrative story that students produce after reading a particular style of a narrative. Could be a multimodal project. Maybe they do something with video or they create a podcast. Other projects, portfolios, where they collect all of these smaller assessments that they've created and put them together in one portfolio and reflect on how each of those smaller assessments sort of help them understand a particular concept, and as well performance tasks here. Underneath the formative assessment umbrella is the informal assessment, and these are things that come by and by along the way. Many formative assessments can be informal in nature, so the purpose is to use all class times as an opportunity to collect data that might help you better understand what progress students are making. So informal assessments ask the teacher to attend to what students say and do during class time, and so they may not be something that you necessarily collect. It could be just observations that you make as you're circulating around the room. You may be doing some whole class activities where you ask questions and you notice that a student isn't perhaps giving a response that is quite on task, and so you think to yourself, that student might need some extra help. So that's a good way to informally assess. So it could be during those whole class opportunities. It could be as students are working individually and you're checking in and having discussions with them. And so you can see how those are very short, very quick, and informal and they're formative because they help inform whether or not students are making progress towards the summative assessment. So the lesson planning of assessments, during the lesson planning process, you'll be expected to explain how you plan on assessing student learning at multiple points. And so each day you're going to have different assessments for that particular lesson. And really these are closely aligned with your objectives. So if you have 2 objectives for the day, you should have at least 2 formative assessments to double check and see whether or not students are meeting that objective. Remember that your assessment should align with those objectives. And so you'll have, of course, summative unit-long objectives, which should align with your summative assessment. And so daily lesson plans should have formative assessments. Unit objectives should have summative assessment plans. So if we think about that example, that metaphor of the running, if I'm going to be running that 5K in 3 weeks, remember, we had that instance where I will be able to run a 5K 3 weeks from today in 30 minutes. That would be my summative unit objective. And so we know that the summative assessment for that summative unit objective is going to be the day when I go to run the race. So that's always the thing that I'm pointing towards. And it's just a good practice. We'll talk about backward design in a little bit, but the idea is that you always have your end of unit assessment created before the unit begins so that you know how to plan and what you're pointing students toward. And so in your lesson plan, your summative assessment will probably stay the same for an entire unit, whereas your lesson level objectives are always going to change, and your lesson level assessments are always going to change. And so as we look over here for daily lesson objectives, Fassbender will run 1 mile in 8 minutes by the end of week 1. And so if that's our lesson level objective, it's more of a week-long objective rather than a daily one. But you can see this is a smaller little chunk that breaks down your unit level objective. And so if my daily lesson objective is going to be that I'm going to run 1 mile in 8 minutes by the end of week 1, then my formative assessments could be, did I even run that 1 mile by the end of week 1? So that's more of a completion grade. But the other formative assessments I might collect are record time of each practice run. So if I look at my Apple Watch and I see that I've run I actually ran the 1 mile, first of all, and did I run it under that 8-minute mile that I was hoping to do? And so that gives me that information. If yes, that means perhaps I'm ready to try running 2 miles in, I think I said 18 minutes. So am I ready to move on to the next step? If not, I need to continue working on that 1 mile until I reach 8 minutes. So that might be my formative assessment, checking in on my smaller goals. My informal assessments could be feedback from a coach on my stride, so getting there, if they just watch me and observe, and then they provide me with feedback on my stride and what it looks like when I run. And I might also attend to how I feel. Maybe I get tired after a half of a mile. Maybe that was because I ate a whole bowl of pasta right before I run. And that's really useful information if I'm going to eventually run that 5K, not to eat a giant bowl of pasta on the day of my race. And so all of these assessments are supposed to help me provide me with the feedback I need to be successful on my summative assessment. And so as we look here, we have our objectives again. We've already talked about these for the giver. And as we look at assessments, we have our informal, we have our formative, and our summative. So I've color-coded again. The red goes with the unit level objective here and the lesson level objective here. The green goes with the, obviously, unit level objective here and lesson level objective here at the top. And so informal assessments could be things like informally gathering information about students as they do their opening activity about careers. Informally, I could be stopping and reflecting and asking questions as we do the reading of The Giver in chapters 1 and 2, so I'll be attending to how students respond to that. My formative assessments will be checking for understanding by collecting the reading guide for chapters 1 and 2 of The Giver, so collecting that daily data and seeing our students understanding the events of chapters 1 and 2. And then also students responding to this notion of empathy. How would they feel if they didn't get to choose their careers? And so you can see here that's the second formative assessment. So collecting their writing and their thinking on that. When I collect that, I can see, are they learning and developing that skill of empathy with characters? And then my summative assessment, as I mentioned, this will stay the same, just as these unit level objectives will stay the same. My summative assessment, if I'm planning to ask students to create their own utopian society by the end of the unit, that's the activity that I'm going to be measuring. And so students will have to attend to not only understanding the events of the Giver, but they'll also have to look for those elements of dystopian novels so that they can create their own utopian society as a way of studying both the real world connection as well as what's happening in the text. And so you can see just by looking at the color coding as well as just seeing how unit level objectives align with summative assessments and how lesson level objectives must align with the lesson level assessments.